And good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Christelle.
Hi, Masego.
Hi.
I hope you're well. Over there, I can hear the birds in your background, and it looks
Yes,
like a
I'm
fun,
well.
shiny day.
Yeah. I'm sitting out in my garden, which is something I've started doing. The more and more we work from home, I often say I like working in coffee shops, and because in lockdown I couldn't go to coffee shops, I found a corner in my garden to convert into a coffee shop so I can sit and work from and be inspired.
That's really cool. I sometimes sit and work out of coffee shops too, out of my own little coffee shop in my house, but the lighting doesn't do very well and my wind chimes
Yeah,
make too much noise sometimes.
yeah, yeah.
So, Maseko, I'd like you to introduce yourself today. Um,
Mm,
what you do, who you are as a
mm,
person, what your politics are.
mm,
Over to you.
mm. Yeah, so let me just start with my name, Masego Madzwamuse, and I am a mother of two very strong girls. The one is 20, and this week she's just started university at Wits amidst all the fees must fall protests. A very important thing to happen, I think, in South Africa. And then my second child is 9 years old. So I've got these two girls with a 10-year gap between them. It makes for a very dynamic household. And then you both keep me very, very busy and, on my toes. And I love them dearly. I am, half Botswana, half from Botswana, half Zimbabwean, with my dad coming from Zimbabwe, and my mother is from Botswana, and I'm born and partly raised in Botswana as well. Currently, I lead the Southern Africa Trust as the CEO of the Southern Africa Trust. I am also a designer, a fashion designer. And this is where I go, the space that I go in order to unlock my creative juices. You ask about my politics. I do identify as an African feminist. I identify as somebody who fights for social justice. So I am a social justice activist. Um, Academic background, studied environmental science and sociology. So I come from a lot of my work from that interdisciplinary background. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Somebody I work with called Elma talks about multi-passionate women, and you really embody this idea of having a full life in multiple things that you're so passionate about. So it's so nice to have you as a reference point as we're trying to figure out what this wholesome life really looks like, feels like, smells like, breathes like. So today we're gonna.
I'm glad there's a word for it.
Yeah, thanks to Elma, there's a term and a word for it too.
It makes me feel normal. It makes me feel
Yeah.
normal that there's a word for it. Yeah.
So today we're going to talk about climate. We're going to talk a little bit about narrative and language,
Yeah.
and the power and the politics of language, of words, of narrative, and how that intersects with the climate justice movement, which you've been such a strong part of from an African and an African feminist perspective as well. So just as a beginning, we talk about climate resilience. And I was reading a paper of yours recently, and there was a pushback from some feminists on the word resilience. And I wanted to open up just to talk about, one, the work that you do, but also where this word resilience comes into play and what it means in the space that you are that uses it so often, but kind of sort of feels like it has a different connotation to the resilience that the African feminist movement pushes back on.
That's a good point to start. I actually remember that one conversation very vividly when we were doing the African Feminist Academy on Macroeconomics, and I was talking about climate change and climate vulnerability. And I recall the discussion was looking at what makes women vulnerable to climate change. And then I started talking about the concept of resilience. And I was blown away at the kind of pushback that I immediately got, which got me thinking about, like you rightfully say, the power of language, and how we sometimes passively use concepts that make sense in one particular field, but in the politics of another space, they are problematic. And that notion has gotten me thinking about why climate resilience is unfeminist, and what language we might use to replace the terminology that has gotten holden root in the climate science space. I'll tell you from a climate change perspective, what I always found appealing about the notion of social and ecological resilience was firstly this acknowledgement that our social systems and our ecosystems and our ecological systems are intertwined. And for me, that made sense from a perspective of having worked and having observed and having lived with a number of communities and populations whose livelihoods are directly dependent on natural resources, right? Directly dependent on natural resources, either for their food security, and even in some contexts, just as a sense of identity and a sense of place, right? So a concept within, and in the field of social ecology, and in the field of ecology, this concept of social and ecological systems, ecological resilience, came up in the early work that was done by Aja, right? And at that time, I think he put together a very interesting paper that the title of the paper was, are there links between relationships and links between social resilience and ecological resilience? And in that concept, it was borrowing from, so within the ecological systems, when we talk about ecological resilience, we're talking about the ability of a system to absorb shocks without losing its form, innovate, learn, and come out of the shock process. So if I were to give an example, think of a rangeland, a grassland, and rangeland ecosystems. Rangeland ecosystems, as part of their regeneration cycles, fire plays an important role, right? So a fire might sweep through a grassland, but when we then talk about whether that system is resilient, it's really a notion of, is the grass able to grow back again after the fires? So when the rains come, or immediately after the fires have died down, can the grass come back? And often if a system is resilient and it's strong, that grass comes back, and it comes back a lot more stronger, it comes out greener, and you get this fresh growth, right? So borrowing, and this is where the limitations of resilience as a concept then kicks in, when we then look at it within the concept of social systems, right? Because social systems don't necessarily behave and behave the same way as nature does, right? And within social systems, yes, we talk about resilience based on whether a social system is able to absorb shocks and come out of that shock system with stronger capacity. But there's different things that make a social system strong, right? It's the political systems, it's the ability to withstand environmental change, and then the ability to withstand social change. What has happened over the years, and is the ability to absorb multiple change that is driven by multiple factors, right? The social, the political, and the environmental factors. What has, however, happened in the climate change space and in the climate resilience space is this narrow focus on technical fixes that are fixing the problem of environmental change, and leaves behind the vulnerabilities that are built in by the inherent marginalization process that takes place in our social and political systems. So when I got that pushback from our feminist sisters on thinking through resilience to climate change and addressing women's vulnerability, I could completely understand why that was, because the focus has been on the technical fixes to climate change, leaving behind the changes within the political and social systems that need to take place.
And what I hear you saying is that there has been sort of an invisibilization of what feminists will always analyze, which is power. Yeah. And so when fire happens in the rangeland, someone's not necessarily set the grass on fire. Mm-hmm. But for, our social order and the neoliberal ecosystem that we exist in, most times there's somebody who's deliberately set fires mm-hmm. on our lives, and we're then asked to be resilient mm-hmm. and to come through. And it's a very perverse, I kind of feel like it's a celebration of hardship. The African woman is resilient, and so she can go through not having access to piped water at her house because she's resilient enough to walk kilometers to collect the water. And I find this narrative really interesting, even as we're celebrating Women's Day this month and Women's Month, the whole month. The number of people who talk about ourselves as women being resilient mm-hmm. and celebrating that. Mm-hmm. And I question what that is. And it really makes me wonder, how do we make sure that all these silos of work and activism and justice work and practicing can begin to speak to each other? Because something that will get so many feminists recoiling back mm-hmm. when you talk about resilience mm-hmm. in the climate justice movement is sort of the word to go.
Yeah.
And where do we begin to unlearn and reimagine new words? And the same goes for words like capacity building. Yeah. That sort of strips down, really whittles people down, African women specifically, to victims, to people who are waiting for help and to be shown which way to go. And this language has been used so much that we find ourselves, even within the movement, using the very same disempowering narratives, words, and language as well. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm curious where you see, or have you seen pockets where it's beginning to intersect between, the climate justice movement, the mm-hmm. feminist movement, mm-hmm. The public services movement, all those spaces? Is there any pockets of hope that we can begin to see the sprouting of something mm-hmm. different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where I actually take a lot of inspiration from the climate justice movement, right? Because the pushback that we're getting from feminists around the concept of resilience is, why should we be resilient in the first place? Why are we not talking about the conditions that require of us to be resilient and remove those, right? And this is the thing with the space of within climate change, is what makes systems not resilient. We have to understand the drivers, the structural drivers of vulnerability. And the reason why I'm saying this is where I get inspiration from climate justice movement is they do actually bring back the question of power, the notion of class, and just this question of the equitable distribution of resources, and people whose vulnerability status is driven by them being having had to contend with multiple drivers of marginalization. So let's bring this back to this whole notion of why women are most vulnerable to climate change. And we hear this being thrown around a lot about, women face the brunt of climate change, but we don't unpack it. What does this brunt look like, and why do women face the brunt of climate change, right? It does, again, if I take it back to what I was saying earlier around communities whose livelihoods are directly linked to natural resources, it does go back to the question of property rights. rights to land, rights to productive assets, rights to productive land, rights to the right kind of land in the right areas, and the nexus between access to land, access to water, access to and within the food security or food sovereignty context, even rights to access to inputs, but the right kind of inputs. Now, if you think about it, if you think about the kinds of responses that have been focused on strengthening women's resilience in climate change, people are very quick to start talking about what has been termed climate smart agriculture, right? Which is access to fertilizers, access to improved seed varieties, which in most cases are GMOs. But nobody's asking the question, do the women own the land? Because you might give them seeds this year, you might give them fertilizers this year, but if you have not fixed the main problem, which is around ownership to land and autonomy around productive assets, are you in fact building the resilience that we talk about in the climate space, right? And it goes back to what I was saying about this over focus on the technical responses, and then shifting the burden to come out of the poverty status that drives the vulnerability to climate change to the individual women themselves, and not having the conversation that looks at undoing the patriarchal system that actually puts women in a position where they don't even have an asset base to develop in the first place, where we're not having conversations about the affordability of the inputs that are being put in place, and as well as within the social systems around the kinds of knowledge systems that are considered to be recognizable science. And the story within the climate justice movement around seed sovereignty actually puts the spotlight on this, because it takes us back to the notion of women as custodians of knowledge. And in that space, if you look at the work that the Rural Women's Assembly does, and the work that a lot of women and women's groups that are running community seed banks, they're running seed banks that are going back to indigenous varieties, which over the years, again, borrowing from the concept of resilience, where it's about learning, adapting, innovating, they are learning, adapting, and innovating, building on generations and generations of knowledge, experimentation, local level science that is really struggling to have a foothold within the broader space of what is, recognized in the climate negotiations, even in the kinds of solutions and packages that are being put forth for communities and sold as climate adaptation adaptation or mitigation responses. And I think climate justice movements basically go back to saying, hang on, can we have a conversation that is looking at the system which has landed us with a climate crisis in the first place? Is the economy the right kind of economy? Are we focusing on the kind of negative environmental footprint that the current production models have landed, and the pressure that it has put on natural systems to an extent that we are faced with this climate crisis? So it's again to really shift the debate and to shift us to focus on the people that have landed us the climate change problem, and to basically say the solution to the climate change problem does not lie with you. You landed us the problem. The solution, in fact, lies with the communities who have always understood what sustainable ecosystems look like, and who've always understood this notion that social and ecological systems are intertwined is not new. If you think about and I'll talk about it from the context of African systems, because that is what I understand and know, and I've spent years studying. If you look at our the world being within the worldview, not the well-being, the worldview within a lot of the African systems, the relationship between nature and people is a very close relationship. Take the concept of totems and totemism. And here I'll draw on examples from Botswana, because that's where I come from and that's the part that I understand. Way back in 1975, when somebody, and I'm sorry, I'm actually going to cite, and that's the problem, is a lot of the literature that is available around understanding the social and ecological systems in our journals is literature that was documented by anthropologists within a colonial context. But that, as it may, it is a body of knowledge that is available that actually did demonstrate that totems, like for instance, if somebody's totem is an elephant or it's an eland, and these are our totems, a baboon, a crocodile, if you say Kimukwena, it actually means that my totem is the crocodile. I don't eat the crocodile. I don't touch it. The belief is if I do, I respond to it. And guess what? When biologists and ecologists basically looked at the relationship between totems and ecosystem integrity, they found that the places where people were located and their totem was the crocodile, as an example, it actually correlated with that area being the crocodile being a keystone species in that area. So it's the area where it gets to breed, it gets to multiply undisturbed. And ultimately, even though people do harvest these resources, it evens out. So the breakdown in systems does not occur. The breakdown in systems occurred at the moment where the market system came into play and the monetization of the resources, the hunting industry coming in, the monetization of the industry coming in, including the dislocation, the dispossession of local communities from their lands and areas being fenced up as protected areas.
Masego, I want to ask, because I'm from East Africa and we have no notion of totems. So I just want to take you back just to explain a little bit about the idea of what a totem is.
Yeah. So a totem would be an animal species that is identified with your clan, associated with your clan. And your identity is your identity. So there's no separation in that point. There's no separation between that animal species and you as the individual or the clan. So I would, if you said, so it would be part of how I identify myself. If you ask me to introduce myself and you say, who are you? And I'm to recite my lineage, I will ultimately take you back to that species that is associated and identified with us. Right? So again, it comes back to when we talk about the natural environment, that natural environment is by no way separate from who we are. It's not separate from us, right? So we respect it. We don't dominate it. We see ourselves as an integral part of it. But if you look at the politics of maintaining environmental integrity, of maintaining ecosystems, it is always about people coming out from outside to teach communities. How do you teach me about my being and how to be when I have essentially grown up being instilled in me? Even in the folk songs, there's a song in a Tswana song. My mother comes from the desert part of Botswana. and it's very dry. We don't have perennial rivers. So fish is really a foreign concept. And we've got a song, a Tswana song. It goes, and forgive me, I don't sing very well, but I've got to do this. And it goes, na ke je tlhapi, tlhapi ke noga, noga ya metsi, setlhare sa baloi. And that translates, I don't eat fish, I don't eat fish. Fish is a water snake, and it is the potent of the witches. Right? And so I can grow up respecting fish and not touching it. But because I come from a pastoral community, I have no problem eating beef, right? Because that is part of the cultural and the livelihood strategies that we have. Now, coming back to the question that you were asking about climate justice, because I think this is very important. You will know that there's this whole movement about plant-based diets as a response to climate change. There's a fundamental question there to be asked: is the plant-based diets as a response to climate change, what kind of livestock agricultural production is harmful to the environment, and which part of it contributes to high emissions? And it's the industrialized livestock production that we see in a lot of the Western countries. It's not the pastoral systems that are in sync. Traditionally, the pastoral systems will be in sync with the heartbeat of the ecological system. We move livestock from place to place to give space for the grass to breathe, also in search of water. But the migration systems of pastoralists and pastoralism as a livelihood strategy and pastoralism as an environmental management strategy have been disrupted, not by pastoralists themselves, but by governments and policies that either have put cordon fences along the way, have privatized the land in terms of chopping it up and giving it out as freehold freehold farms to arable agriculture in sedentary forms, without looking at what that means for migration routes, what it means for negotiating over overlapping rights, and whose livelihood strategies and whose culture and the understanding of livelihood strategies is in fact informing the policy responses that are then putting up the fences and dividing up land for, arable agriculture and, marketing this as foreign direct investment and so forth. And what the climate justice movement does is to take us back to that and say, wait a minute, these kinds of agendas that we're seeing coming out of the international space, it's for whose benefit? Who is at the table? Whose voice actually counts here? Have we sat down to understand, are we holding the people who are in fact responsible for the kinds of carbon emissions that have landed us this climate crisis, or we are now putting that burden on the very groups that are vulnerable? So in what way are we building resilience when we do that? It goes back to the politics of the politics within the climate change space, bringing back the question of equity, bringing back the question of voice, bringing back the question of power. Whose power is recognized and whose power is driving the narrative?
And that's really interesting on so many levels. I'm sort of like sitting here snapping my fingers below the camera. One interesting statistic that I heard the other day is Africa contributes less than, I think, 3% to global warming. Yet we are the site of all of this, taking over our farmlands to plant, carbon sequestering trees or whatever it is. We are the site of all these innovations that will make us climate smart or whatever it may be. We're the site of innovations constantly. Nobody in the global north innovates how they're going to open a tap and brush their teeth in the morning or switch on a light. But but we're constantly under this pressure to innovate because we have to, make better the whole world in which went through an industrial revolution based on so many of our resources, so much of our free labor, our raw materials, carried on coal that completely destroyed the environment, but then yet we are supposed to correct years of their growth, a growth that's centered on GDP, that centers and obsesses over this idea of economic growth that doesn't take into consideration all these elements and intersections that you're bringing up, you're putting forth today, and also our histories and our nuances and this notion that we didn't know what we were doing and we didn't know how to live in amongst our environment and manage it. But yet, market comes in and says, let us capacity build you to take care of your wildlands, your wildlife, and your economy and your environment. And so it also puts a bit of light onto this idea that we can't constantly just follow a global wave of what's happening as Africans. This idea that we must all go vegetarian and vegan because it's better for the climate. And that whole movement without really opening up, unpacking as an African what that actually means. And so it seems pretty disparate from where I'm sitting. Are there any pockets of hope, of light that you're seeing in the work that you do with the communities that you work with, the collective?
So I each time I'm asked that question, and I'm at the risk of sounding like a broken record, but I must say that there's two movements, right, that for me are pockets of hope, and it's the food sovereignty movement. And is the agroecology movement, the Pan-African agroecology movement. The other movement that is, for me, offers pockets of hope is the Rural Women's Assembly. And I'll tell you why. Because the Rural Women's Assembly and the way that the women have organized themselves has been really organizing around rural women taking back their power. And rural women occupying space, and unapologetically so. And they do this by being very, very vocal about holding the polluters accountable for the mess that we're in. But while doing that is also not so much as, because again, when you look at, just going back to what you're saying about Africa faces the brunt and yet we contribute very little. When you follow the money and the resources and how much actually comes to Africa, not much is coming this way to respond to the problem of climate change. And if it does, it's for projects, climate smart agriculture projects. It's really projects that are problematic in my sense. And the Rural Women's Assembly, they're not looking for those kinds of funds. They reject those funds. And what they have done is to set up groups where communities are teaching each other about agroecological practices. And I'm using the word teaching loosely because I think it's a process of remembering. It's a process of awakening the memory, right? And this thing that they do on an annual basis of doing the seed festivals, and the women bring indigenous seed varieties, and they do it in an exciting way. They tell stories about these seeds, the origins of the seed. They share recipes. They have a whole celebration with song and dance and food. The way that we share knowledge. And the way that we share knowledge and we transfer knowledge from either one generation to the other or one community to the other. And they do, and what I also like about what the Rural Women's Assembly does is in those seed festivals is to do political teach-ins. Because it's again to remind the women that, look, it's not about how much seeds we can get our hands on. It's about what we can do to disrupt the political system that has landed us here. It's about what we do to disrupt the social system that has landed us here. How do we go back to our communities and navigate the cultural systems that we operate under? And I'm always taken over by emotions when I'm in the presence of members of the Rural Women's Assembly, because I think what they do there is really, really quite powerful. And it's really about reclaiming space, reclaiming memory. And I can't find the words for it, but there's something that happens when you go deep down to go through a process of remembering. And somebody put it to me recently that, from the word remember, it's about putting your member back to you, back to the self. And that is possible, because that is about the wisdom. It will not come from out there. The wisdom is not about somebody from the World Bank coming to teach you conservation agriculture and digging holes and that kind of thing. No, it is really about going back. And there's been some really interesting work that is happening in South Africa. There's a group called out in Limpopo. And just as I was about to talk about them, their name, Zumalamupo. And that it's a group of women from the vendor communities. They're known as the Mawenzis. And from somebody who doesn't understand the vendor cultural context, they would say to you, women in the vendor culture are subjugated and they don't have rights. But women in the vendor culture hold very powerful positions. They're custodians of knowledge. And this group of women were powerful enough to drive a very successful campaign against the coal mining company that wanted to withdraw water from one of their local rivers, right? And the mining company comes up with shiny plans. There'll be 1,000 jobs that are created, and the lights will come and jobs will. And the women said, no, that river is part of our sacred spaces. It's a place that we go to for various kinds of rituals. But one of the things is really where we go to as holders of knowledge about, and they reorganized themselves. And they were asking difficult questions. These 1,000 jobs, for how long and for whose benefit? You are going to actually, put the risks of thousands of families' lives and livelihoods at stake for 1,000 seasonal jobs. That doesn't make sense. So again, that process of remembering and going through memory and going back to cultural practices that are not harmful, but cultural practices that are actually important for keeping the social and ecological, healthy social and ecological linkages in place, played a very important role here. And if the women hadn't gone through that process of remembering, and that process of reclaiming the space, and that process of revaluing the sacred spaces, they would not have had the power to say, hang on, we don't care what mine you're bringing here. We don't care that it's going to bring electricity. You are not touching our sacred waters, right? So I think there's multiple levels of this kind of work. And I often find in the development space, and in the spaces that, a lot of the spaces that both you and I would occupy, is we are not spending enough time in understanding what the meaning, what places hold for not only people's livelihoods, not only people's economic benefits, but what they hold for their social being, their mental well-being, and so forth. And then lastly, the other part within a global level that I draw inspiration from, and I know it's somebody that you and I follow quite closely, is the work around degrowth that people like Jason Hickley are driving, and a few other people. What I would say though is I would really like to see a lot more of those alternative narratives being driven from our continent, and especially being driven from and by African feminists, because I would really love to be able to drop African feminist names on these subject matters and not be citing men. Wangari Maathai was our leader in this aspect. If there's somebody who helped me with the language and with the understanding and just being able to see the notion of how development, human rights, and environmental rights intersect, the way that that woman lived, her politics, did that so powerfully for me.
Thank you, Masego. I just, first of all, I want to say a big thank you. I have learned so much in this conversation, so much more than I ever imagined. Actually, I'm not an expert in the climate space, and I lean on the great minds like yourself and so many others. But something that seems to be a connecting thread, as you spoke today, was quality over quantity. And you made reference to this notion, whether it comes to land, what the quality of land, and when women have access or ownership of land, what sort of land is this that we're talking about? That is, how productive is it? When we even talk about vegetarianism and veganism, that this is a whole, it's sort of blown my mind. Quality rather than quantity, right? We're not talking about mass cages of chickens, but in the way that we know our chickens on the continent, they're running around pecking at things, almost, happy chickens, right? And they're doing their part in the circle of life, as cliche as that is, but also jobs. When all these big multinationals and market forces come onto our lands and are promising 2,000 jobs for this mine or whatever it is, the quality of those jobs and what are we losing for these 1,000, 2,000 jobs that are paid less, almost at minimum wage, if your country even has a minimum wage. And so it's really talking about, for me, what I hear is opening it up with our histories, reclaiming our histories, reclaiming who we are, knowing that culture is not static and it evolves. And so we don't always have to take the bad elements of it, but there's so much good in what we have, and we can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater. And really going back to who we were in our analysis, in our narratives around this, but also, and this is something that you really challenged me so many times, to produce the knowledge, the analysis ourselves, to be able to quote each other. So that we're not having to quote, people who use us as case studies in their analysis and narratives, but we live here and we're owners of the land. We're custodians of the wildlife and the wildlands of this continent and the processes that come along with it, right? So I just want to say a very big thank you. I have learned so much. I feel like we have to do a season 2.
Yeah. and just one last thing, and it's what you're saying about our role in producing the knowledge, and for me it's really about our connect, and we understand it because we are connected to the places. So we don't get into a space and talk about them, because sometimes we are them and they are us. When I was talking to you about totemism and my mother's place, her people, that's me. So when I get into a science space, I am not talking about this in abstract terms. I am talking about this from understanding of self. So I agree with you. We have to reclaim the spaces. We have to produce the knowledge itself. We have to find the language. And we still haven't found the term to replace resilience.
But thank you for challenging us as well. I always take the challenge: write more, speak more, produce more knowledge, lean on our own experiences, our histories, our nuances, our realities, because this isn't just work for us. This is, like you're saying, this is our lives. These are our lives.
This is us.
It is us. So I'll stop there. I'll say a very big thank you.